Hello, my name is Diane, and today I want to talk about the best books I read in 2023. These are the 10 books that I read this year that I liked more than all of the other books. They're not ranked in any particular order, they're just the order that I happened to read them in. It was hard enough to just pick my top 10, so I didn't want to make it even harder on myself and try and rank them in the order that I liked them in. So the first book I read that I absolutely loved this year is The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. This follows a girl who is fairly young when the story starts, and we see her grow up throughout this story, throughout this trilogy. This is the first book in the Winternight trilogy. And as she's growing up, there's a lot of things changing with religion and the way that her town is being run. And she's also discovering the magic in the world around her. There's a very interesting mix of historical fiction and folklore in this story, and I really like the way that they were blended together. I thought it was very interesting to see some kind of familiar folklore elements, although ones that I don't know too much about specifically. The story does have a mix of historical fiction and folklore, and I really like the way that they were blended together. I thought it was a very interesting basis for the story, and then to have our main character going through some of these things that actually happened in history, but done in a very fantastical way with the elements of the spirits that are in the house and around the house and her relationship with them, all of these mystical beings that end up being a part of her life. And I just loved the setting and the atmosphere of the story. It felt very magical the way that it was written, and I think it very much suited what was happening, just following this family and seeing them grow up and their lives change, and hers in particular. And I just found this to be a very captivating story. Next up, I have The Lost World by Michael Crichton. This, of course, is the sequel to Jurassic Park, where one of our main characters comes back to go on another dangerous dinosaur adventure. I really liked this story and the way it played out. I've already seen the movie before I had read this book, so I liked seeing the differences in what was done in the book versus what I had already known of the story from the movies, and I thought those were interesting changes that were made. But I also just like the way that the story plays out. I think the way Michael Crichton develops his plot and things play out, it's definitely very scary what's going on, but I don't think he writes them in a very over-the-top way. They're just a little more matter-of-fact happening, and they're just scary on their own. And I liked seeing a familiar character in a somewhat similar situation, although a little bit different from Jurassic Park. I like these types of stories where there are modern day people interacting with dinosaurs, and I think the way that he introduced dinosaurs into the world, rather than having them living on this secluded island that nobody knew that they were there and then discovering them, he's brought them back through science in a very strange way. I liked being back in this world with some familiar characters and a bunch of new characters, and seeing a similar but somewhat different situation from the first book, and how they're in danger around these dinosaurs, why they're around these dinosaurs, and hopefully how they're going to escape them and make it home safely. I like adventure stories, I like suspense stories, and I like dinosaurs, and this has all of those. Kings of the Wyld by Nicholas Eames. This is a quest story about an older adventurer who one of his old friends comes to ask him for help. His daughter's in trouble and he needs to get the band back together to save her. And having a young daughter himself, our main character Clay agrees, and they together go and get the band back together. I really like this story. I think it's a lot of fun. I loved the main characters in this. I loved their dynamic, the group, the band that they're a part of. And I also like that there are a lot of classic rock references to play off of them being a band. While they're a band of adventurers, there is a big play on them being a band and going on tour. And the way that some of that's interpreted in a fantasy setting I thought was a lot of fun. There's a lot of little Easter eggs of musical references that if you don't know them, I don't think you're missing anything within the story. You can still definitely have a lot of fun with it, but they're just something a little bit extra for people who notice them. I picked up on some. I'm sure there were plenty that I missed, but I just thought this was a fun story. There's a lot of danger and obstacles along the way, a lot of interesting things brought in, but I mostly liked the dynamic between the characters and seeing them try to get through this alive. They're going into it kind of assuming it's going to be a suicide mission, but they have to at least try. So this had a lot of things that I really like in a story. I like a questing story. I like seeing a group go on an adventure, especially if there's good dynamic and banter between them all, and this book definitely has that. Illuminations by T. Kingfisher. I don't hear too much about this book, and I think it's a shame. I don't know if it's just the people that I follow aren't reading it, or if it's just been overshadowed by T. Kingfisher's other similar works, but this follows a girl who lives in a city with her family, and they are magical illustrators. They create illuminations, which are basically magical paintings that can serve a particular purpose if they're done correctly, and she is learning how to do that. And she one day in her home discovers this box, and there's something about the box that is compelling her to stay away from it, and when she realizes this, she becomes even more determined to figure out what is in this box. She accidentally ends up unleashing something potentially very dangerous and has to try and figure out a way to stop it and undo whatever she may have done. I think this story is just a lot of fun. I like the main character. She has a best friend who she seems to be on and off with, and we see them kind of try to work things out as they're trying to work together, as her friend gets involved in what's going on. There's also a very wonderful family dynamic in this story where she lives with her, I think, an aunt and uncle and a couple other family characters. No parents or siblings, but a bunch of extended family, and how they wind up getting involved in realizing what's happening with her and trying to help her. I just think it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of kind of ridiculous things that happened in T. Kingfisher's way. There's some very bizarre things, some kind of creepy things, but everything's a little bit quirky, so nothing feels very dark or gruesome, even if there's some weird stuff going on. And I just think this story is a lot of fun. I think if you liked A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking, you would definitely like this story. It has a very similar feel to it, even though it is a very different story. The Lies of the Ajungo by Moses Osiotomi. This is a novella following a boy called Tutu who lives in a city in the desert, and his city doesn't have any water of their own, so they have made a deal with another people, and they have agreed to give this city water in exchange for their citizens' tongues. Once they reach a certain age, they cut out their citizens' tongues and send it to these people, and as long as they keep doing that, they keep receiving water to keep their people alive. Unfortunately, they receive very meager amounts of water, and Tutu's mother is not doing very well at all. He's very worried about her health, and he goes to the leaders of his city and asks them for permission to go out into the desert in search of water to provide for these people, not only to save his mother, but to save all of them from this very bizarre bargain they've struck with these other people. And they agree and send him out, and we follow Tutu, who has only ever known this city, only ever known what they have taught him about the world, going out on his own into a very scary, very unfamiliar world, encountering other people, and he's not really sure what to believe or who to trust. And all he wants is to find water and save his mother. And we end up learning about the world and what's really going on within it through Tutu's eyes, and I think that's very interesting that we have such a limited perspective on things, but that's how he's experiencing things, so it makes a lot of sense for the story. And we go along with him as we try to find water and figure out what's actually going on here, until eventually he returns to the city with some answers, whatever he's found. I really liked the story. I loved Tutu and going through this kind of emotional roller coaster with him of sometimes thinking he's found the answer and then finding out more information, and then when he does find the answers, finding out what that actually means for him and his city. And I think it's a very interesting journey to go on with him. Infinity Gate by M.R. Carey. This is a sci-fi that follows three main characters. We basically go through them one at a time. We start with one main character and see her world and what she's doing. Her world is in a very desperate state, and she is working in a lab to try and figure something out, figure out some sort of solution to make things better. And eventually her story leads her to discover something, and that discovery brings us to our second character, where this story passes off to our second main character, and we see his world and how he's living his version of Earth, because there are many versions of Earth, many parallel dimensions in this world, in this book, and how his story relates to that first character, how their paths eventually cross. And that leads us to our third character. We meet them and see her world, and it's very different from the other two, and she eventually, how she becomes wrapped up in these other two characters' lives and whatever they're doing at this point. I don't want to give too much away, but by the end of the story, they are all together and the plot has really picked up. And this definitely is very much the first half of their story. It's how they all came to be together. There is an AI that is developed throughout, and it's in a different state in these different worlds. But a lot of the story has to do with these three main characters, how they wound up together, how this AI that we meet at the very beginning of the story eventually develops, possibly, and how all of these Earths are potentially connected. I just liked the writing of this. I found it very engaging. Even once we switch from one character to the next, we spend a lot of time with that first character, and then the story suddenly shifts, and it felt a little jarring at first, but it also felt very easy to get into that second character's head. I thought it was very interesting how their stories overlapped and moved from one to the next, and I am very excited to continue with this and see where their story is going to take them. I'm honestly not sure where their story is heading, but I'm having a lot of fun just going along for the ride and seeing how things develop and play out. The Sword Defiant by Gareth Hanrahan. I know I said I wasn't ranking any of these, but if I had to have a single favorite book of the year, I think this would be it. This is a fantasy story following a main character, Alf, and he is one of the 9 heroes that saved the land from this dark lord. They took over his city, and he is the keeper of one of these dark weapons that this villain had, and he needs to protect it and keep it from falling into anyone else's hands. The sword is a character of its own. It talks, it has its own personality, it has its own agenda, and I think it's very funny, the dynamic between him and the sword. I think it's a very funny element to add to the story. And he knows that there is something bad coming, but he's not sure what it is, so he goes to get his group back together to prepare for whatever's coming and to hopefully stop it. And as he goes along the way, he's learning more about the world and what's possibly happening in it, also learning more about the heroes that he was once a group with and where they are now, because it's been some number of years since they all worked together. Some of these supposed good guys are doing some kind of shady things. Some of the villains, once we find out what's coming and you find out their intentions, you have to wonder, how bad are these people actually? And there's a lot of play on that gray morality, which is something I really enjoy in stories. And I just like seeing him go through and get reacquainted with these people and figure out more about what's going on in this city that they've taken over and what's actually coming. And I like that he just goes from one place to the next, which he thinks is his destination. It's not an overall A to B quest. He goes from one location to the next where he meets more people, gets more information, and then figures out what his next move is, goes there, and the story progresses like that. So you don't really have an endpoint at the start of the story. You think you do, but things get switched up as he goes along the way and learns more things, and I really liked that. I really loved some of his old companions that we get to meet again. And this just had a lot of things that I really love in fantasy stories. It has a very big, rich world that feels like there's a lot of history there. There's a lot of relationships that already exist that we're discovering. Everything feels very well developed, and I really liked the main character. I liked going on this journey with him. I liked the play on good and evil, where good maybe isn't perfect and the evil maybe has good reasons for what they're doing. I liked that our main character feels like he's really in the middle of that. I highly recommend it if you also like adventure fantasy stories like that. Next up, I have The Crane Husband by Kelly Barnhill. Kelly Barnhill has quite a few other stories out already. I've had my eye on a couple of them, so I'm glad I finally read one of her books. This is a very bizarre story following a teenage girl who lives on a farm with her mother, who is an artist. She's kind of unreliable as a parental figure, and she also has a younger brother. And one day the mother brings home this 6-foot tall crane and basically says, "This is your new father," and he moves into the house and lives with them. It's a very bizarre story. It's very surreal. You're not really sure, or I wasn't really sure how to interpret the crane, if it was just her perspective on things or if it was an actual literal crane. It's very strange the way that it's described and the way that certain things happen, especially the way the ending plays out made me questioning things even more, but I really loved that about it, having that uncertainty of, I think it's pretty clear what this represents, and the way things in her household was, things are not very good and things get even worse once this crane shows up. He really makes their lives a lot worse, but the mother doesn't seem to see that, and it's kind of heartbreaking the way things play out, but also things resolved in a very interesting way. And I just felt very invested in seeing what was going to happen next as things progressed within the story, how this main character was going to cope with what was going on, because she's very set on, more than anything, protecting her younger brother, who's a little too young to really understand anything that's going on. I thought it was a very bizarre but a very gripping story. Gods of the Wyrdwood by R.J. Barker. This is a story about a man who lives alone near these woods, and he really just wants to be left alone. He has a mysterious past about him, and he's lived in this place, and he just wants to be left to do his thing and live his life there unbothered. And one day he gets asked to help go into these woods to find someone who has gone missing, and he agrees, although he doesn't really want to. He's also the only person who can really navigate these woods safely. They're considered very dangerous to venture into for a number of reasons, but he has this very interesting bond, this relationship with this forest, which the setting feels very magical in this. I loved the atmosphere of this. I loved the description of the forest and seeing how he navigates it and how he has this sort of bond with it. He picks up a few companion characters along the way, and I really liked their dynamic with one another. They're a small group, but I liked the way that they interacted. I liked seeing them develop their relationships with one another. And I just overall liked the tone of this. I liked the magical feel of it. I liked the mystery of what's going on and what's going to happen. And it had that great dynamic between characters that I always like to see. So this is the start of another series that I definitely want to continue with, because I want to see what's going to happen with these characters, how their relationships are going to develop further, how maybe more of the past of our main character is going to come up, and see more of his relationship with the forest as well. And the last book I want to talk about is Morgan Is My Name by Sophie Keach. This is an Arthurian retelling following Morgan, particularly her younger life. We see her as a young girl and learn how Uther Pendragon became her stepfather. And we see her growing up and the expectations he has for her, that her family has set for her, and the things that she wants for herself. We see her discovering her love of healing and uncovering magic, and the goals that she has for herself, but also the expectations that are put upon her and the path that she is reluctantly set upon. I think this was very well written. I was very engaged with what was going on with Morgan. I like her generally as a character in retellings, but I feel like she's usually a side character, at least in the retellings that I've seen. Tends to focus a lot more on the men in the story than on the women. And I really liked that this very much focused on Morgan, that even though Merlin and Uther and Arthur are all a part of her story, they really are just a part of her story, and this is very much her story, and they're just kind of there as side characters. They have a part in her life, but they're certainly not the focus of anything. There's also a bit of romance, although that doesn't overshadow the story. It's mostly about her developing her powers and discovering them and figuring out a way to learn more. She just really wants to get more of an education, learn more about magic, learn more about healing, and help people. And I really liked seeing her in that light with that kind of drive that I think even if you're not specifically into Arthurian retellings, I think you could definitely enjoy this story, not knowing anything about Camelot or these other characters. I think this was just a very engaging story about Morgan and her coming into her own as she grows up. So that is it. Those are the 10 best books that I read this year, the ones that I just keep thinking about. I really like talking about them and recommending them to people. They're definitely the ones that have stuck with me throughout the year. Even some of these I read at the very beginning of the year, and I still keep thinking about them, and that for me is the mark of a favorite book, if it really sticks with me long after I've finished it. Let me know if you've read any of these or what your favorite book of the year was, even if it wasn't one of these. I'd love to hear that. That's all for me today. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you next time. Bye.